Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's video, we step back into one of the most unforgettable moments in the life of Jesus. A moment that not only tested the faith of his closest followers, but also revealed his divine power in a way they would never forget. Imagine yourself on the open sea, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. At first, the air is calm, the waves are gentle, and the boat sways softly as the disciples talk quietly among themselves. The day had been long, filled with crowds pressing in on Jesus, listening to his words, longing for his touch, and desperate for healing. Now, evening had come, and Jesus had asked his disciples to take him across to the other side of the lake. It seemed like a simple request, just a routine trip across the water. But what lay ahead was far from ordinary. As they pushed away from the shore, the disciples likely thought it was just another journey with their teacher, another chance to be near him, to listen to his wisdom, and to learn more about the kingdom of God. The sea, wide and glistening under the fading light, gave no warning of what was to come. But the disciples, many of whom were seasoned fishermen, knew that the waters of Galilee could change in an instant. A peaceful evening could turn into a terrifying storm without notice. And that night, that is exactly what happened. Suddenly, the wind began to rise, fierce and unrelenting. The gentle waves turned into crashing walls of water, pounding against the small wooden boat with frightening force. The disciples grabbed the ropes, their hands slipping on the wet wood, their hearts racing as the storm grew stronger. The sky darkened above them, lightning split the heavens, and thunder shook the air. The sea roared, and the boat rocked wildly, threatening to capsize at any moment. Their voices rose in fear, each man shouting orders, struggling to keep the boat afloat. These were men who had faced storms before, but this one was different. This storm felt overwhelming, unstoppable, almost as if nature itself was raging against them. And in the middle of all this chaos, Jesus was there, but not in the way anyone expected. While the disciples fought desperately for their lives, Jesus was in the stern of the boat, asleep on a cushion, at peace, in the middle of the storm. The contrast could not have been greater. Around him was fear, panic, and the threat of death. Yet there he was, resting calmly, untouched by the storm that terrified everyone else. The disciples looked at him, hardly believing what they saw. How could he sleep at a time like this? Didn't he care that they were about to perish? Their voices grew louder, their fear more desperate. They rushed to him, shaking him awake, shouting over the roaring wind and crashing waves. The storm was only getting stronger, and their hope was slipping away with every passing moment. Would Jesus rise and do something? Could he really change anything in the face of such overwhelming power? Or would this night end with the boat swallowed by the sea, their journey cut short by the storm? The waves kept rising, the boat kept shaking, and the question hung heavy in the air. What would happen when Jesus finally opened his eyes? The disciples stood frozen for a moment, their hands trembling as the boat lurched violently under the pounding waves. Water poured in over the sides, soaking their clothes, chilling their skin, and weighing them down. Every gust of wind felt sharper than the last, cutting through their fear and making their hearts race even faster. They knew this sea well, its calm mornings, its busy afternoons, and its sudden tempests, but never had they faced anything that felt so threatening. Each man's mind was filled with dread, and yet somewhere deep inside, a small thread of hope clung to the thought that Jesus was with them. But what could he do if he was still asleep? Some of the disciples exchanged desperate glances, their faces pale in the dim light, their voices shaky as they tried to steady one another. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, men who had grown up on these very waters, were used to storms. They had rowed through strong winds before, guided boats through crashing waves, and battled against sudden squalls. Yet even they now struggled to keep control. If experienced fishermen were losing hope, what chance did the others have? Matthew, the former tax collector, clung to the side of the boat, his knuckles white, unused to the demands of such a night. Others held on tightly, feeling every crash of the waves slam into their bodies. Above them, the storm raged on with a fury that seemed almost alive. Each flash of lightning revealed faces twisted with fear and exhaustion, while every roll of thunder drowned out their frantic cries. They were exhausted, drained from the long day with the crowds, and now every ounce of strength was spent trying to survive the sea. Still, the water kept rising, filling the boat little by little, and panic began to consume them. Through it all, Jesus lay still, his breathing steady, his body resting as though untouched by the chaos. The disciples could hardly understand it. How could he remain so calm while their lives hung by a thread? They whispered among themselves, torn between awe and frustration. Some wanted to let him rest, as though his peace might somehow protect them, but others could no longer wait. The storm was relentless, and they were running out of time. At last, their fear overcame their hesitation. They cried out to him, voices breaking with desperation, "Master, don't you care if we drown?" The words hung in the air, heavy with both accusation and hope. Would he answer? Would he even hear them over the storm's roar? The boat shuddered again, tilting dangerously as another wave struck, and their hearts sank even lower. The question remained, trembling on their lips. What would Jesus do now? The cries of the disciples rose above the wind, but their fear was louder than their words. Each man wrestled not only with the storm outside, but with the turmoil inside his heart. Peter, usually bold and confident, felt his strength slip away as he fought the oars, his muscles burning, his voice hoarse from shouting. He had faced storms before, but never one like this, never with such darkness pressing in on every side. In the back of his mind, questions he had never dared to ask now surfaced. Was their journey with Jesus leading them to life, or to death on these waters? James and John, brothers who had grown up learning the sea's moods, locked eyes for a brief moment. They both knew this storm was different. The waves seemed almost deliberate, as though the sea itself was determined to swallow them. For Matthew, who had lived a life far from the dangers of the water, the experience was unbearable. His hands slipped on the wet wood as he clung desperately, every flash of lightning reminding him of how fragile he truly was. Andrew tried to steady him, torn between helping his brother in faith and keeping the boat from breaking apart. The conflict grew heavier as the storm raged on. Some of the disciples doubted whether Jesus would act at all. Others clung to the belief that he would not abandon them, though they could not see how. The boat creaked under the weight of the crashing waves, each strike echoing their doubts. The storm outside reflected the storm within, the struggle between fear and faith, despair and trust. And still, Jesus lay resting, silent, as though the raging sea did not exist. The disciples' eyes returned to him again and again, desperate for a sign, waiting for something to change. The boat was now almost swallowed by the raging sea, tossed back and forth as though it were nothing more than a leaf on the water. Each crash of the waves sent icy spray into their faces, blinding their eyes and chilling their bones. The disciples shouted over the roar of the wind, their voices breaking with fear, each man clinging to what little hope remained. The wooden frame groaned under the force of the storm, every creak a reminder that it might splinter at any moment. Darkness covered them like a heavy blanket, broken only by flashes of lightning that lit up their terrified expressions. Their cries to Jesus grew louder, more desperate, almost pleading now. The thought of drowning pressed down on them with suffocating weight. Even the most seasoned among them could feel the end drawing near, as though the sea had already claimed them. Some rowed with trembling arms, others bailed water with frantic hands, but nothing seemed enough. Every effort felt useless against the furious waves. Fear was no longer just in their voices. It was written in their eyes, in the way their hands shook, in the way their breath came short and uneven. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, Jesus remained still. The sight was almost unbearable. How could he rest when the world around them was falling apart? They shook him harder, their shouts piercing the storm, desperate for him to respond. Every second he stayed silent stretched longer, heavier, as if time itself was slowing down. The tension filled the boat, heavier than the water rising inside it. Their cries blended with the wind, their hearts pounding as one thought consumed them all. What would happen the moment he finally opened his eyes? The moment felt unbearable as the disciples waited, their hands gripping the boat with desperation. The storm had already pushed them beyond exhaustion, but just when they thought it could not get worse, the winds shifted with an even greater force. The waves rose higher than before, towering walls of water crashing down around them. Each surge sent the boat tilting so violently that men stumbled across the deck, nearly thrown overboard. Fear turned to terror as the storm revealed a darker side, as though it had only been holding back until now. The disciples' shouts grew frantic. They had thought the storm was already at its peak, but this second wave of fury left them completely undone. It was no longer a question of keeping the boat afloat. Their very lives felt as though they hung by the thinnest of threads. With each thunderclap, the air trembled, and the sea seemed determined to swallow them whole. Even the strongest among them felt their strength giving way, their arms heavy, and their will almost broken. The water inside the boat was rising fast, and every attempt to bail it out felt hopeless. Some began to believe this storm was more than just a storm. Their whispers grew urgent, their eyes darting to Jesus and back to the raging waters. Was there a deeper meaning to this moment? Were they being tested in ways they did not understand? The thought sent a new shiver through their hearts. Fear of the sea was one thing, but fear of the unknown. Fear that they were facing something far greater than nature itself left them shaken to the core. Their calls to Jesus became cries of both fear and frustration, voices breaking as they clung to their last fragments of hope. Would he remain silent forever? Could he truly sleep through this unrelenting chaos? Another monstrous wave crashed over the boat, knocking several disciples to their knees, leaving them gasping for air. The storm was no longer just outside. It was inside the boat, inside their hearts, inside their faith. The question grew louder with every strike of the waves. When would Jesus rise, and what would he do when he finally spoke? At last, Jesus stirred. The disciples, soaked and trembling, watched as he slowly rose from where he had been resting. The storm still howled around them, waves slamming into the boat, thunder rolling overhead. Yet his presence suddenly felt stronger than the chaos. He stood in the midst of the fear and panic, his calmness contrasting sharply with the disciples' desperation. Lightning flashed across his face, and for the first time, the men felt as though the storm itself was pausing, waiting for what he would do. With steady eyes, Jesus looked at the sea that threatened to swallow them. His voice cut through the roar of the wind, firm and unshaken, as he commanded the storm to be still. In an instant, the wind began to die down. The furious waves melted into gentle ripples, and the thunder faded into silence. What had moments before been a nightmare of crashing water and roaring winds was now an eerie calm, the boat resting quietly on a sea as smooth as glass. The disciples could hardly breathe, stunned by the sudden transformation. Their fear of drowning vanished, replaced with an awe that left them speechless. They turned to each other, their eyes wide, whispering, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm had been. For though their lives had been saved, they now faced a truth far greater than their fear, that the one standing among them held authority not only over men, but over creation itself. Yet even in this moment of wonder, an unease lingered. The silence of the sea was almost too perfect, too sudden, as if the waters themselves were holding a secret. The disciples felt relief, but also a trembling in their hearts, as though this calm was not the end of their testing, but only the beginning. They had seen Jesus command the storm, but what other powers would rise against them on the path they were walking with him? The sea was still, but in their souls, questions raged louder than the winds had moments before. The disciples sat in silence, their hearts pounding as they tried to take in what had just happened. Only moments ago, death had felt certain. The storm had raged with a force beyond their strength, leaving them helpless and afraid. Yet with a single command, Jesus had turned chaos into peace. The waves that had once towered over them now lay still. The wind that had screamed in their ears now hushed. The Sea of Galilee stretched calm and endless around them, reflecting the stars that began to break through the clouds above. They looked at Jesus, their teacher, but now also something far greater. The questions in their minds could not be easily answered. Who was this man, that even the storm obeyed him? Was he only their guide, their healer, their rabbi, or was he carrying authority that reached beyond the world they knew? Each disciple carried the weight of that thought differently. For Peter, it stirred a sense of boldness he could not yet explain. For Matthew, it revealed a truth that numbers and logic could never capture. For James and John, it deepened the mystery of the one they had chosen to follow. As the boat drifted quietly on the calm waters, they began to realize the storm had not only tested their strength, but their faith. They had faced the reality of fear, doubt, and helplessness, only to see that Jesus was greater than all of it. The lesson was not only about survival, it was about trust. Even when he seemed silent, even when he was resting, he had never stopped being in control. The storm was real, but his power was greater. By the time the boat reached the other shore, the disciples carried more than relief. They carried a new understanding of who walked beside them. The memory of the storm would remain, but so would the memory of the calm that followed. It was a reminder that storms will come, sudden, fierce, and overwhelming. But with Jesus, no storm has the final word. And as they stepped onto the shore, the night still fresh in their minds, they knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would continue to challenge, surprise, and transform them forever.